You mentioned in the book, and to me that's a very sad thing, that you can't remember your sister Olivia de Havilland having done anything warm or kind.
Far from the shiny utopia often portrayed, old Hollywood was a battlefield of egos, betrayals, and decades-long grudges. Some stars kept it civil, while others went to war. Here are 10 old Hollywood celebrities who absolutely hated each other. Number 10. Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor. Hollywood's golden age had everything: peak films, iconic faces, and never-ending scandals. But only few compared to the heartbreaking fallout between Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor. Reynolds, the wholesome girl next door, stole hearts in Singin' in the Rain, while Taylor, the sultry violet-eyed beauty, became Hollywood royalty with films like Cleopatra. Despite their differences on paper, both queens were practically inseparable. They attended the same Hollywood events, confided in each other, and even went on vacations together. Debbie trusted Elizabeth completely, but that trust would prove to be her downfall. The catalyst? Eddie Fisher, a popular face in the entertainment world, and Debbie's husband. They raised 2 kids together, had an ideal life, and were one of the more close-knit couples of the era. However, everything changed when Taylor's own husband, producer Mike Todd, tragically died in a plane crash in 1958. Taylor was notably stricken with grief and became more reclusive. Debbie did everything in her power to support her best friend, including urging her husband to tag along. But what she didn't know was that Eddie was far more than a shoulder to cry on. Comforter turned lover, and just like that, Hollywood's most scandalous affair ignited. Debbie found out when she called Taylor's hotel room one night, only for her husband to answer. She felt a lump in her throat as her world shattered. Hollywood's golden couple quickly became the biggest tabloid sensation of its time. The breaking point? Eddie's decision to end the relationship and be with Taylor, marking what must have been an incredibly humiliating split. Debbie and Taylor became bitter rivals after that and were never seen together again. The worst part was that Debbie had the lower hand. Taylor married Eddie Fisher in 1959 and enjoyed their time together until fate and karma had other ideas. Taylor fell for Richard Burton while filming Cleopatra, leaving Eddie in the same way he had left his precious wife. Meanwhile, Debbie carried herself with grace, becoming an even bigger star while raising her children. She gained the respect of Hollywood by walking away from the debacle, while Taylor was left with yet another failed marriage. If that's not karma, we don't know what is.
Tell me more about this business.
Oh, there isn't much to tell.
What's the matter?
I'm just wondering if you have to,
Oh.
Number 9. Frank Sinatra and Humphrey Bogart. What is it with Hollywood and scandalous love triangles? Just like the drama between Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor, Frank Sinatra and Humphrey Bogart's bond unraveled because one of them crossed the line in the other's relationship. The woman in question? Lauren Bacall, the spitting image of a femme fatale. You might want to grab a snack for this one, guys. Before Sinatra and Bogart became one of Tinseltown's most heated feuds, the duo were surprisingly good friends. They had their differences, but bonded through their love for drinking and wild parties. Remember the original Rat Pack group? Bogart and Sinatra formed it alongside a group of Hollywood elites. It was a hard-drinking, fun-loving social circle for people like them. Bogart was the cool-headed alpha male, while Sinatra, charming and cocky as ever, was the life of the party. Bacall herself gave the group its famous name, once joking that they looked like a rat pack after a particularly wild night. And for a while, everything seemed perfect. Bogart and Bacall were the ultimate Hollywood couple, and Sinatra was a frequent guest at their parties. Everything changed in the mid-1950s when Bogart's health began to rapidly decline. Bacall was devastated with Bogart's esophageal cancer and needed a shoulder to lean on. Sinatra, the ever-present third wheel, was supposed to be the support guy, but he had other plans. It was a golden chance to make Bacall his. Surprise, surprise. Sinatra was known for his womanizing ways, and some believe he had feelings for her for years. But perhaps the most surprising twist is that Bacall wasn't as infatuated with Humphrey Bogart as many assumed. Matter of fact, her first impression of him was less than flattering. She found Cary Grant more appealing and had zero sparks for Bogart when they first met. Her feelings only changed while filming the 1944 classic To Have and Have Not. They developed a connection despite having a 25-year age gap. So, could that be the reason? It's possible that Bacall would have resisted Sinatra's charms if she was instantly smitten to Bogart, but that's hard to say. Sinatra was in the right place to take advantage of Bacall's emotional state. Bogart wasn't blind to what was happening. He knew that Sinatra was stealing his woman away from him, but he was powerless to make it stop. He hated Sinatra and called him names, the only thing he could do given the circumstances. Bogart passed away in 1957, leaving Bacall a widow at just 32 years old. She continued her solace in Sinatra, with every move making tabloid frenzy. Some saw it as a natural progression, while others believed it was a betrayal of Bogart's memory. Whatever the truth, it didn't last. Sinatra notoriously hated commitments and was reportedly furious at Bacall for announcing their engagement. He called the relationship off immediately, humiliating Bacall in the process. In the end, neither man won the feud. Bogart had the love of Bacall, but he died knowing his friend had been circling on his wife. Sinatra, on the other hand, ended up alone. He publicly humiliated Bacall and wasted a close-knit relationship with Bogart, all for nothing. That said, Hollywood relationships weren't always torn apart because of cheating scandals and love triangles. Sometimes it's a clash of talent and egos that spiral out of proportion. Number 8. Marlon Brando and James Dean. For all of the enmity between them, Marlon Brando and James Dean were cut from the same cloth. They both rose in the 1950s and had similar charisma, and both carried an effortless rebellion that made them instant legends. But perhaps the greatest similarity was their deep commitment to Stanislavski's method of acting. It gained popularity in Hollywood during the 1950s and encouraged actors to draw from their own life experiences to generate genuine emotions in their performances. With so much in common, it's curious that Brando resented the rise of Dean as a movie star. He saw Dean as an imitation, a cheap knockoff of himself, and he hated it. Let's circle back to how it all started. Remember the early 1950s when Brando cemented himself as Hollywood's ultimate outsider-turned-superstar? With back-to-back successes in A Streetcar Named Desire, Viva Zapata, and On the Waterfront, Brando had the industry at his fingertips. His energy was refreshing, the acting immersive, and critics hailed him as the future of cinema. Then, James Dean came along. His sublime performance in 1955's East of Eden made him an overnight sensation. And the best part was that he practiced the same tortured, misunderstood loner energy that Brando had spent years perfecting. Dean's next film, Rebel Without a Cause, not only intensified comparisons, but also made him a Hollywood obsession. Suddenly, journalists were calling Dean the new Brando, who was now spiraling into a quiet, simmering rage. He thought Dean was too polished, too pretty. Hollywood's attempt to package his own rebellious persona into something more palatable for teenage audiences. Was he right, though? Not necessarily. Hollywood took advantage of a younger Dean, but the rising star never tried to overshadow Brando. One night at a Hollywood gathering, Brando took Dean aside and offered him some advice. It was more of a backhanded insult. He told Dean to drop the act, as he would never be like him, a thinly veiled insult stemming from jealousy. The issue, however, was that Dean was cut from the same rebellious cloth as Brando. He idolized him as an icon, but refused to let Brando control his path. Sadly, the rivalry came to an abrupt end when James Dean lost his life in a devastating car crash in September 1955. He was just 24 years old. His three major films, East of Eden, Rebel Without a Cause, and Giant, became cinematic legends, and posthumous accolades poured in. That's not to say Brando lost his way. He built a legendary career, earning multiple awards, including an Oscar for The Godfather, which he famously refused.
When was the last time that you spoke to your sister?
I did not speak to her at my mother's memorial, and so it was the previous telephone call when she wanted my mother operated.
Number 7. Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine. Admit it, we've all had spats with our siblings. We've fought, made amends, and gotten away with a lot of mischief. Sibling rivalries are nothing new, but when you throw fame, fortune, and Oscar gold into the mix, well, it gets pretty dirty. That was the case for Olivia de Havilland and Joan Fontaine, two sisters who spent their entire lives locked in an intense, often cruel competition. The worst part? It lasted for decades, right up until their final breath. Contrary to what most people think, the seeds of their animosity were planted early. They were raised in a tense household with a domineering mother who allegedly favored Olivia. Joan always felt like she was in her sister's shadow, and it didn't help that Olivia was older, strong-willed, and far more confident. Joan was reserved and often sickly as a child, ingredients for Olivia to assert her dominance. Joan later claimed that Olivia bullied her, once even breaking her collarbone during a fight. Wondering why Joan never used the family name? Their mother forbade Joan from using it. When she became an actress, Olivia was under contract with Warner Brothers, and her mother didn't want Joan to work there too. There was only room for one de Havilland in Hollywood, and Joan had to pick her stepfather's name, Fontaine. When both sisters found their way into acting, their childhood rivalry only escalated. Olivia gained fame first, landing roles in films like The Adventures of Robin Hood and Gone with the Wind. But Joan wasn't far behind. She made a name for herself in Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca. 1942 marked the climax in their feud when both were nominated for Best Actress at the Academy Awards. Joan won that night, but the sisters never celebrated together. Olivia even ignored her hand during the gala. Though Olivia went on to win 2 Oscars of her own, the feud extended far beyond their careers. The sisters refused to speak and frequently took jabs at each other in the press. Joan once cheekily remarked that she married and won an Oscar before Olivia, and if she died first, her sister would be furious because she'd beaten her to it. True to her words, Joan passed away in 2013 at age 96. Olivia, still very much alive at 97, responded with cold indifference. She refused to make a public statement or bury the hatchet that had spanned nearly a century. In the end, Olivia may have won more Oscars and outlived her sister, but was it really a victory? Their feud was a lifelong battle, and neither sister truly won. They spent their lives trying to outdo the other until there was no one left to compete with. Coming next, we have Number 6. Bette Davis and Tallulah Bankhead. Golden Age Hollywood legends Bette Davis and Tallulah Bankhead were alike in a lot of ways. They were both powerhouses, strong-willed, sharp-witted, and unapologetically ambitious. They both exuded sex appeal, commanded attention, and never shied away from delivering a brutal one-liner. With personalities that big, it's hardly a surprise that the pair came into a bit of conflict. But how exactly did it begin? You see, Tallulah Bankhead was a force to be reckoned with on stage. She was a Broadway icon, a woman with the kind of magnetic presence that made audiences hang onto her every word. But Hollywood? That was a different story. Bankhead struggled to reach the high ceiling she hoped for, and watching Bette Davis dominate the industry only made things worse. Then came the final straw. Davis secured lead roles in 3 film adaptations of plays that Bankhead had originally made famous on stage: 1939's Dark Victory, Jezebel in '38, and The Little Foxes back in 1941. Bankhead was furious. Her career was declining while Davis was reenacting her roles, the ones she perfected. She felt Davis was stealing her spotlight for the big screen. To add insult to injury, Davis received critical acclaim and Oscar nominations for them. It was like watching someone else live the career she had dreamed of. By the time Davis featured in 1950's All About Eve, Bankhead was as furious as anything the industry had ever seen. She snapped, saying she'll tear out every hair of Davis's mustache when she gets hold of her. It was a brutal attack, one that cut deep, considering how often Davis was mocked for her features. However, Bette Davis got the last laugh. Bankhead might have been furious, but her rival knew exactly how to fire back. Davis was offered $10,000 to impersonate Bankhead on The Ed Sullivan Show, but she coolly declined with a devastating line, "Miss Bankhead isn't well enough known nationally to warrant my imitating her." Ooh, ouch! It was a masterstroke of shade, dismissing Bankhead as a has-been not even worth mocking. With sharp exchanges flying back and forth, it's hard to say who truly won this feud. But as we'll soon discover, Bankhead wasn't the only Hollywood star with whom Davis had a beef.
Don't you know that a man being rich is like a girl being pretty? You might not marry a girl just because she's pretty, but my goodness, doesn't it?
Number 5. Marilyn Monroe and Laurence Olivier. Hollywood has never been short of legendary feuds, but the notorious clash between Marilyn Monroe and Laurence Olivier was the stuff of legend. Unlike the drama between Davis and Bankhead, this particular feud stemmed from a misunderstanding during the troubled production of The Prince and the Showgirl in 1957. What started as a convergence of icons quickly soured into a battle between old Hollywood tradition and the new emerging power of method acting. An icon of classical theater and a woman who was fighting to be seen as more than just a pretty face. At first, Marilyn was thrilled to be working with Olivier. She admired him as her idol and was excited to meet him on set. What's crazy is that The Prince and the Showgirl was a Marilyn Monroe production. It was her chance to move beyond the dumb blonde roles and prove that she was more than just Hollywood's most marketable star. Olivier, for his part, was just excited. He lavished praise on Marilyn during press conferences, calling her an excellent comedienne and an actress with a rare ability to switch effortlessly between innocence and mischief. It was a perfect match on paper, the most celebrated stage actor of his generation, alongside Hollywood's most famous star. What could possibly go wrong? A lot, apparently. Marilyn had been studying method acting under Lee Strasberg and was deeply committed to her process. Olivier, however, had no patience for what he saw as unnecessary theatrics. He dismissed method acting entirely, telling Monroe that sensuality was all she needed. That condescending remark changed everything. Monroe, who had spent years fighting against the industry's tendency to reduce her to nothing more than a sex symbol, was furious. She began to rebel, arriving late to set and becoming increasingly uncooperative. The hostility between the two actors became impossible to ignore. Olivier's inner circle, including Anthony Bushell, tore into the actress. He wrote scathing letters about the situation, calling Monroe a black-hearted trollop and a hellhound. He also berated her for fumbling one line 22 times, to the point where he wanted to walk out and physically beat her. Despite their mutual loathing, Marilyn and Olivier begrudgingly finished the film, but The Prince and the Showgirl was doomed from the start. It failed to impress critics and performed poorly at the box office. Little wonder it's barely mentioned when discussing either star's career and filmography. If you found this beef thrilling, wait until you hear about Marilyn's next spat with a Hollywood icon. Number 4. Lauren Bacall and Marilyn Monroe. Ah yes, Lauren Bacall makes her second appearance on today's list. She was part of a feisty love triangle with Frank Sinatra and Humphrey Bogart, but there's no romantic entanglement this time. Instead, her connection to Marilyn Monroe came through their work together on 1953's How to Marry a Millionaire, a classic comedy that paired them with Betty Grable. And while there was no dramatic fallout between Bacall and Monroe, their time together wasn't without its challenges. You see, Bacall had mixed feelings about working with Monroe from the start. She found her to be sweet and kind, but very unreliable. Why? Because Monroe had a bad habit of arriving late on set. Bacall thought of it to be irritating and frustrating. But here's the thing. Unlike others who dismissed Monroe as unprofessional, Bacall had a different perspective. She felt Monroe was so lackadaisical because she was afraid of failure and constantly seeking reassurance. And yes, she couldn't bring herself to dislike Marilyn. It's kind of touching, really. Producers feared the two might grow jealous of each other, but Bacall's maturity quickly put those concerns to rest. Matter of fact, she praised Marilyn for being photogenic and having the gift of captivating anyone who sets eyes on her. In the end, there was no major falling out, just a mixture of sympathy and occasional annoyance. If anything, Bacall recognized what everyone else refused to acknowledge. Marilyn was never a villain. She was just trying to survive in an industry that only wanted her for her features. Marilyn's feud with Laurence Olivier is a prime example. If you're enjoying today's video so far, why don't you subscribe to the channel and turn on your post notifications so you'll never miss another exhilarating ride. It's free and a win-win situation.
When you find a guy worth keeping, be satisfied. Make sure to treat him very kind. 'Cause a good guy is hard to...
Number 3. Frank Sinatra and Shelly Winters. Oscar-winning actress Shelly Winters was as renowned for her talent as she was for her eventual love life. She walked down the aisle 4 times before her passing in 2006 and was rumored to have had flings with some of Hollywood's biggest names, including Sean Connery, Errol Flynn, Marlon Brando, and Burt Lancaster. However, she couldn't win them all. One man was seemingly immune to Winters' charm: Frank Sinatra, her co-star in the 1952 musical Meet Danny Wilson. The craziest part is that Sinatra's character longed for Winters on screen. It was worlds apart from their topsy-turvy off-screen dynamic, one far less romantic. Now, there's no official explanation for why Sinatra targeted Winters, but many believe it was a case of passive aggression. By 1952, he was going through a rough patch following his divorce from Nancy Barbato, a split that went against his faith and weighed heavily on him. He lost weight rapidly and caused chaos on set, with much of his frustration seemingly directed at Winters. He once called her a bow-legged B-word, a cutting insult that didn't sit well with Winters. She punched him in retaliation and fired back with her own insult. Although they managed to finish the film, their mutual disdain was hardly a secret. Winters later admitted that she found Sinatra arrogant and difficult to work with. Meet Danny Wilson was both their first and last collaboration. Still, Sinatra's story is puzzling. The man was going through a rough patch and couldn't bring himself to act with class and grace. His chemistry with Winters was amazing on screen. One can only wonder what could have been if he was in a better state of mind. The feud between Sinatra and Winters may not have been as long-lasting as some Hollywood rivalries, but it was certainly explosive. The two made several films independently, but Sinatra went on to win an Oscar for his supporting act in 1954's From Here to Eternity. Number 2. Orson Welles and William Randolph Hearst. Citizen Kane is one of the most perplexing films in Hollywood history. It's celebrated as one of the greatest films ever made, but was a complete disaster when it first hit theaters in 1941. The reason? 3 words: William Randolph Hearst. Unlike the fiery, in-the-moment spat between Sinatra and Winters, this feud was a slow-burning vendetta that nearly destroyed Citizen Kane before it even had a chance to become the legendary film it is today. Welles was a 25-year-old wunderkind who sought out to create what he believed would be his magnum opus. The story of Citizen Kane centered on a media tycoon named Charles Foster Kane, whose rise and fall mirrored that of real-life newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Welles, on his part, denied that Kane was solely based on Hearst, but the similarities were impossible to ignore. He swore to nip the movie in the bud, taking full advantage of his ruthless control over the press and politics. The end result? One of the most aggressive smear campaigns in Hollywood history. Hearst ordered the press to talk bad about the film and forced his newspaper to blacklist the film entirely. No advertisements, no reviews, and no coverage. He was willing to do anything to limit the film's reach, including pressuring theaters not to screen it. But he didn't stop there. Hearst reportedly tried to ruin Welles' reputation by setting him up with an underage girl. It was a desperate attempt to sully Welles' name by painting him as a deviant. Citizen Kane managed to score 9 Oscar nominations, though it only won Best Original Screenplay. Many believed Hearst's influence had poisoned the Academy's voting process. Hearst's smear campaign worked to an extent, and it took a good few years until Welles' film was reassessed as the cinematic masterpiece it's revered as today. Hearst passed away in 1951, while Welles followed more than 3 decades later in 1985. But in a fitting 2012 twist, Hearst's own descendants hosted a screening of Citizen Kane at his famous Hearst Castle estate. Whether that was an act of reconciliation or a final twist in their feud is anyone's guess.
She went to all the New York nominees and said, if you can't get out there, I'll accept your award. And please do not vote for her.
Number 1. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. That alone tells you why Bette Davis's feud with Joan Crawford deserves to take the top spot. This wasn't just a spat. It was a decades-long battle filled with career sabotage, personal jabs, and on-set violence. And yes, it all started because of a man, Franchot Tone. He starred alongside Davis in the 1935 film Dangerous, and she fell head over heels for him. There was just one problem, though. Tone was romantically involved with Crawford and was engaged before shooting ended. This left Davis humiliated and, by all accounts, seething with jealousy. The worst part, Crawford's marriage to Tone eventually crumbled, yet it still wasn't enough to end the animosity between the two actresses. Things took a turn for the worse when Crawford joined Davis's studio, Warner Brothers, and the two were in direct competition for roles. Their mutual animosity was no secret, with both trading sharp insults over the years. A notable example was when Davis once claimed that Crawford had slept with nearly every male star at MGM. Both actresses' careers were waning by the 1960s, and they decided to unite in the psychological horror, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane? But if producers hoped that pairing them together would put an end to their feud, they were gravely mistaken. Davis reportedly kicked Crawford so hard in one scene that she required stitches, while Crawford retaliated by lining her costume with weights during a scene where Davis had to drag her across the floor. It's a miracle how the film became a huge success and secured Davis a Best Actress Oscar nomination in 1963. Think death was enough to bury the rivalry? Think again. When Crawford died in 1977, Davis, as expected, made one last cutting remark. She stated that it's customary to speak kindly of the dead, then added, "Joan Crawford is dead." Good. Rivalries like this were likely a spectacle of pure drama, but it's hard to deny their impact on the history of cinema. Let us know in the comments which feuds you think rocked the industry the hardest, or share any of your favorite ones we missed. And while you're here, don't forget to like, subscribe, and check out more jaw-dropping stories from old Hollywood like the one currently displaying on your screen.